Welcome to Alternate Endings.
Half audiobook.
Half podcast.
Full apocalypse.
New episodes every Monday.
Start your week considering how everything could come to an end.
For all the stories we have featured here on Alternate Endings thus far, we have gone forward in time, and now for the first time for the stories of this podcast, we go back in time. Hello, listener, and welcome to the recap episode for Terror Adrift, our first short story to be fully based on a previous real-world event, to my knowledge, unless I'm seriously misspeaking in that case.
As far as we know, there was no zombies running around or
Dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs.
I mean, Jurassic Park, but that wasn't real, you know.
As far as we know.
Right.
This is the first.
On public official record. You never know what's being stored in Area 51.
I mean, we already know that they kept this a secret for... Most people still don't even know about having this be a true story, so maybe to some of our listeners, they're just as surprised as we are.
Which is a perfect segue. Thank you very much, Tyler. First, let's introduce ourselves. I'm Ivan.
And this boy right here is Tyler.
And we join you, and we want to let you know that we found out about this idea of true events that occurred in the year 1944 during the Great World War II. And I found out originally through a Radiolab episode podcast called Fugo. That's F-U-G-O. So that's going to be one of our sources that we refer to a lot for information on this episode. I also looked at atomicheritage.org, washington.edu, and I also looked at some excerpts from the book Fugo, The Curious History of Japan's Balloon Bomb Attack on America by Ross Cohen. So we got several sources.
All assuming that this is from World War II stuff, nothing post or pre. This is all dealing with facts of this specific event, right?
Yes, and some information that we found afterwards.
Yes, regarding what?
Fugo.
Oh, Fugo.
The incident.
Oh, just about that incident in itself.
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
So the first balloons were spotted when they started going down all across the Pacific Northwest. Some ranchers in Montana saw them. Some people found these strange balloons out in the middle of nowhere. Some people found them dangling on power lines, and people weren't really sure what they were. They had no idea. And the first balloon that was caught, and this is a crazy story, I'm going to encourage all of our listeners to please check out this Radiolab episode, Fugo, F-U-G-O. Crazy story how they even got the first balloon to figure out what it was.
How they caught it, they roped it in.
It is like something out of a Wild West movie.
Is it actually?
How they actually, yeah. So, and I'm going to skip the punchline how they found out where it came from. But eventually, they located that these balloons were being launched off a very specific beach in Japan. They were being launched off the main island of Honshu. So they were all launched from the same regional area. So for those who don't know, this was an incident in World War II where Japan kind of had a Hail Mary idea. They wanted to instill random terror from above on the United States of America. There was a jet stream that traveled east across the Pacific Ocean, and that if they launched balloons in the right fashion with bombs attached underneath, they could make it all the way to the United States in a very interesting fashion. So in the story, we mentioned ropes dangling. They had 30 sandbags attached to them, and each night the balloons, because of the drop in temperature, would fall out of the jet stream, and there was an altimeter attached to each sandbag. The sandbag would automatically drop into the ocean, and the balloon would re-elevate back up into the jet stream. So the idea was the balloon had to make it there within 30 nights in order to drop finally somewhere in the United States.
When I was first listening to it, and when Beth was looking at the balloon, she thought they were hot air balloons at first, and then she realized, wait, that's not a basket. What is that? And so it gave me that thought, how did they initially even get, was it helium based, or what were they using do you know how it guided it across?
Yeah, they were giant helium balloons, and they were about 33 feet in diameter. So she thought, that looks like it's huge. It's bigger than a house. They were about 3 stories wide.
That's crazy. That's bigger, as far as my knowledge. I mean, that's bigger than probably a lot of hot air balloons on their own.
Yeah, I've seen some that are huge. I went to the Albuquerque Hot Air Balloon Festival, and some of those are massive, but it's a pretty big balloon.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, if you think about it, it's got to be able to have enough helium in it that it's going to last essentially 30 days, like you said, before it's going to drop, on top of there needing to be, I mean, all the work that goes into sandbags being able to drop and based off of altimeters. I mean, it's got to have some sort of supply that'll fit that demand of that great distance it's got to go across.
Yeah. And the bombs they weighed somewhere in the area of 900 to 1,100 pounds.
Yeah, see, that's ridiculous.
So the payload it was carrying was extremely heavy.
So it had to be that big. They had to think about it. To be able to carry, as you said, 900 pounds of bomb. Beth even thinks about, no way that could carry a human. There's not, but in all actuality, it's carrying 10 humans.
Yeah, way heavier. If those humans were very thin.
If they're very thin.
Which many people back in the 40s were thin.
All children, 100-pound or less.
You know, this was kind of like a period piece. It was very strange. I actually listened to 1940s music during almost the entirety of 3 to 4 days leading up to me writing the story. And one thing that was odd to think about was back in the 40s, nobody recreationally worked out. It was not a thing. You were either thin or you weren't. People didn't go to the gym. That was not something that the average person did. Like 2019, many people do.
Unless you were the bodybuilder or you were the actor or something of the sort. But yeah, I mean, you don't ever really see it in old movies that they're focused on, oh, let's go pump some iron or anything of the sort.
Like you see an old movie like Spartacus or Hercules, and you see these people who are supposed to be the strongest people on earth. And they look like your average person working out at a gym these days.
Just a little, tone, but yeah, they don't look ginormous unless you were born that way. Lou Ferrigno, even not 1940s, but I mean,
right.
That's getting in more closer to a area where you were starting to lift up. But even then, he was the Hulk, who's supposed to be huge, and he was not very big in comparison to what we see today.
He looks like a dad.
He does. He does look like
a dad who kind of kept in shape, but he doesn't look like the Incredible Hulk.
No.
Like if we showed someone from the 40s, like the Avengers, they probably would pass out in the middle of it because they'd be overwhelmed. They just didn't. They didn't have those things.
Do you know how many balloons they actually sent across? Because in this story, it seems like there's hundreds. You've got to take the shot. You don't know how many are actually going to get there. So do you know how many they sent out?
Do you have a guess?
I would probably somewhere under 1,000.
Under 1,000. And how many do you think actually made it to their intended target of the United States?
Maybe 15.
So from November 3rd of 1944 through the beginning of April 1945, so for about 4 months, they launched 9,300 balloons.
And how many of those 9,300 actually connected?
300.
300, dang.
Less than 1,000 made it to the United States. And eventually, Mexico and Canada also reported balloons.
That they had some.
A lot of them landed in the Pacific Northwest, but one balloon was reported making it as far east as Detroit.
Personally, I think I remember when we were talking, or I may have heard about this before, I think one landed in Colorado, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Rural Colorado, out in the mountains. And a lot of these balloons went down in rural places, because that's one thing about the 40s as well, is thinking about population of the American West. Most places were remote or very rural.
If there were cities, that's probably more most people actually were, compared to in these spaced out little either mountain towns or ranch towns or wherever in the flats.
The special Japanese force that was tasked with Fugao admitted that they wanted to produce over 20,000 balloons.
And did they just not have the time, or?
It was time and resources, yeah. They were ending the end, we were nearing the end of World War II. I looked it up just for some time perspective. So this happened late 1944 into the early 1945. And then on August 6th and August 9th is when the nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
So whatever they may have still had planned, they didn't get to enact further on.
So, why they stopped early? And this factors into the end of our story. The United States, after a couple of weeks, put out a very, very strong, some report it as a threatening message to all media outlets, all radio stations. Do not mention balloons. Do not mention anything.
Do you know if they said the reason, or did they just threaten?
You're asking perfect questions here, Tyler. At first, they did not tell anybody why. They didn't even tell them what this was. It was mainly a cover-up. And nobody was being told what these balloons were. The federal government would confiscate them, and then everything was, nixed. And the Japanese were waiting. They were just waiting on
that fear.
on bated breath, to hear the terror, the random questions from Americans. And of all the 9,300 balloons they launched, they only ever heard about the results of one. And it landed in Wyoming, and it did not detonate. That's the only one they ever heard about through any news source and any news outlet. It's just, when you think about the amount of people who saw like 300 balloons and saw some of them detonate, and the Japanese never heard of it.
Still didn't even know.
So they were only halfway through their project and they shut it down because General Kusaba decided to stop it because he thought that none of the balloons had made it at all. So they just shut down the program thinking it was a complete failure. But it was on America's strategic part just not to talk about it.
Incredible forethought from the United States to think, hey, we don't fully know what this is. Do you know if they had already figured out where they came from, or is this purely just, hey, we know someone's sending them, so let's pretend that they're not hitting because they're trying to, obviously they're big balloon bombs that are supposed to scare you.
I don't know the timeline for when they found out where the source was from, but the U.S. military did find it out relatively quickly. And when you consider the 1940s, again, everyone, go check out the Radiolab episode. It is mind-blowing how they found out
how
where
you can figure it out. If all of a sudden you have a balloon in Detroit, or even Wyoming, or Colorado, or Pacific, like, yeah, they're all on the western side, but Detroit's not west.
No.
So you could never really know where they came from unless, I mean, obviously they found the stream that sent them that way, so.
Now this story just becomes an exaggeration. It is my mind running wild and imagining, what if all 9,000 made it? And what if they all happened to unfortunately fall in the same region?
In the exact same. So
and that's what the story is.
For Roland, California. That is where it is set, correct?
It is Redding, California.
Or Redding.
And then eventually they run down south about 30 miles to Orland.
That's okay. I combined them. So
these are actual towns I looked up.
That's what I was about to ask. Do you know what the population of Redding, California was in the 1940s?
I could not find it out. I couldn't even find photos, so it probably was very rural.
Really? You couldn't even find photos of it?
Today it is about 220,000.
Okay, so I'm assuming some minuscule portion of that just based off of the way people have moved across and then population growth in general.
I imagined it a town of like 3,000 to 4,000 when I was writing the story.
The FBI and the sensory board was...
the United States Office of Censorship.
Yeah. I mean, they still have to be able to come in. It can't be a big city that it's landing in, or else that's going to most likely spark some panic. That's going to get out beyond. So it would have had to be a smaller town for the 9,000 balloons to hit.
Right. Well, these were popping all over the United States, and they still were able to keep it under wraps, which is very impressive. So listeners may be sitting there wondering, if this was a huge, massive scale movement in World War II, how come none of us know about it? How did your loyal hosts here at Alternate Endings, how did we not know about it? Because after they decided to keep it secret so that Japan wouldn't know about its relatively small success, they decided not to tell anyone. They never let the secrets out, and the information did not get declassified until 30 years later in the mid-70s.
So did they just decide, hey, the war is over, we might as well just release it?
Eventually, yeah. So the one time that the military decided to tell some people about what it was, so they decided that they would tell Americans only, we want to inform you, do not touch these objects. Here's what they are.
Them.
Yes. If you find them, call the appropriate authorities, because unfortunately a death occurred. Now, how many would you say? So now you know about 300 fell within the United States. How many deaths would you estimate occurred?
Well, if there's 300, they found one that was undetonated, and that never went off. I'd probably guess less than 10.
Okay, that is a very good guess.
Yes, my sir.
There was only one death incident.
One death. One death total, or a one incident that caused death?
So it was 6 fatalities on one incident, and it's very sad. And before I tell this story, I'm only going to tell part of it. A survivor of this story is featured on the podcast episode of
the Radiolab. Wow.
A pregnant woman and her 5 children were at a picnic, and they noticed some strange object off in the park. and they went over to look at it. And by what the bomb investigators found at the scene afterwards, indicated that one of the kids decided to kick the carousel, and it blew up.
Oh, not even the balloon itself, the bomb container.
Yeah, and killed all 6 of them.
Where was this?
This was in southern Oregon. Yeah.
So where a majority of the balloons they found. Wow, that is terrifyingly sad. I know this is completely unrelated, but when you think of balloon and death, personally, I think of the Hindenburg disaster. Obviously, it's different in that it was a blimp and part of it was gases that caused it. But in that alone, there was 97 people aboard and 36 people died.
Oh, wow.
Of that total. And one of them was a worker on the ground. So if you think about those proportions of how many survived that, and then you take it into this story where from what we've seen, Beth walks up to a house that they're following the balloon like, wow, what is this? This is amazing. They're running down. Like all of a sudden it blows up in your face. And she's like, I imagine myself in this house. I know for a fact there are children and a family in here, just to eventually have one mom and baby come out and she's screaming. And that was the first incident. And then you look around and there's, at least from what they counted, like 30 balloons. And then there's supposed 9,000 of these that go to this town and surrounding towns. Did you have a specific death toll that you think might have occurred or no?
No idea. So I've been to the Albuquerque Hot Air Balloon Festival. I also highly recommend that. It's an amazing thing to do because when you look straight up, there'll be balloons that are hovering right above you. So they're massively in your field of vision, but that's just because they're close to you.
Yeah.
And there are balloons that you saw take off that are huge, bigger than like the biggest mansions. And you can cover them with the end of a pin because they're so high up. And to see your entire field of vision covered by balloons of various sizes only because of how far they are, that is what I imagine. Like, what a sickening feeling it would be to look up in the night sky over your hometown and you see the bottom of all of these white balloons, orange lit by the light from houses and fires going on. And there's just such a weird part of the psyche, I think, that gets activated because when we think about weapons, we think about them as moving fast, missiles, bullets, right?
Uh-huh.
Even when you throw a punch, it's fast. And weapons are...
Or guided.
They're guided, and they're targeted.
Yeah.
They have a destination, a bullseye in mind. When you look up in the sky and you know that bombs and napalm fire is attached to all these balloons, and you think that they're just randomly adrift, I think there's something that clicks in the human mind that is like very unsettling about that it's slow moving, it's silent, and it is complete luck if it happens to fall on you or not.
And of course, for this town of Redding, California, in our specific story, they are not the lucky ones.
They are not.
I mean, well, so how far is Orland from Redding?
It's about 30 miles, 40 miles.
Okay, so within that area, they already, when they're driving down after the fact, they already noticed less and less balloons.
Yeah.
So this was a very, very isolated, unlucky for them, maybe lucky or unlucky for Japan sending them out, but I mean...
Right. The idea was, what if, coincidentally, when they started launching all 9,000, they all started going to roughly the same place? That would suck if you happen to live in that place.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Especially when you don't know what they are at first. And I mean, she saw a flash of light. Was that at the very beginning, was that one going off? Like, why did they not hear it?
So if listeners caught that, yeah, there's no fire, no explosion, just a bright flash of light. And that was inspired by a Montana-specific real sighting back in 1944. Some ranchers were out camping or I think working at night, and they saw a bright flash. And what had happened is a balloon drifted sideways into some power lines and then dangled there, and it blew the transformer.
But it didn't actually blow up the bomb itself.
Right, because the bomb never touched the ground.
Okay.
So then the authorities got the balloon and they figured it out.
So it was purely impact that caused the bombs to go off. It wasn't like an electrical current or something wouldn't have done it.
And another fascinating thing about these bombs is the balloon was designed that when the bomb exploded, the balloon itself would float up into the sky. So the idea is that it would leave absolutely zero trace. That an explosion would go off, people would turn around, and there'd be absolutely no indication of where it came from.
And you saying that does remind me when Beth and George see the one actually go off, she does mention that the balloon still goes away. That's a really cool little detail that you added that without knowing the actual purpose, you would just think, oh, it just like a balloon got cut off at a party and the one that went away. But that's what they were designed to do.
And the book we mentioned up top had a really good point about this happening in 1944. The United States considered itself very fortified because we were surrounded by two different oceans. At that time, the concept of an interballistic missile didn't exist. And Japan was the first to actually have a weapon that could cross an ocean and be an intercontinental weapon. It was the first idea of an intercontinental missile. And
Without
they
any
launched it.
testing at all. I mean...
So they tested the idea for 2 years.
Oh, okay.
On much smaller balloons, just to see where they would go. And they kind of had this inkling that we could make it to the United States, and so they started production.
They just scaled up and then sent them from there. Like you said, they had no idea that if they were even getting there, they didn't think they were reaching America. You would think they would have some sort of a plan to be able to recognize the fact. But I mean, I guess we were at a very tense part in the war where Japan had came over and made an attack on the United States, so they weren't about to be a forefront presence.
Yeah.
And this is near the very end. So.
Yeah. And the Japanese actually ran a propaganda campaign in the middle of launching these balloons and claimed over their media sources that they had already killed over thousands of Americans with Fugo, which was a lie.
So in Japan, people knew they were being released. They were letting people know, hey, we've sent long-range attacks and they're working. We are winning. Yeah,
because they wanted to give the Japanese a morale boost because they were losing and it felt like the war was closing in on them.
I did not know that.
But all they ever knew is that one balloon made it and it didn't go off in Wyoming. That's all the Japanese knew through the rest of World War II. It just blows my mind, man.
That just blows my mind that
as soon as, and I mean as soon as, the episode ended from Radiolab, I said, this is the next story for alternate endings.
This has to be it.
And I just thought, like, what would it be like if the Jetstream had just coincidentally sent them all to a similar place? And I kind of thought, like, so they're all landing in Redding, California, but you head south. In my mind, I thought it's hitting everything north of that just as bad.
Okay.
So I'd say Oregon probably got inundated in this fictional story. And that just all the areas around there were just on fire. And
so they just got lucky going south instead of deciding to go north. Okay.
Like if you drew a circle of impact in our story here,
Redding would have been the southmost tip.
Yes.
Okay.
They'd be on the bottom of that circle. And imagine all the forest fires, because not only were some of the bombs infused with explosives like regular TNT and stuff, some of them had potassium nitrate, thermite, and intentional fire spreading chemicals.
So literally just like napalm specific.
So I mentioned fire and like ash a lot in the story, and that's because not all of them would explode. They would just land and spread
fire really quickly.
Yes.
Get a little Daenerys action in there.
That's right. Yeah, the mother of balloons. Freer of sandbags.
Oh, Japan. They're on top of it.
Yeah, they tried.
They did try. This whole time I've been thinking about who is still left in Redding, because this is, I assume most people in the United States, especially military age boys and men, are going to be off in the war. So why specifically was Elizabeth's dad still there? I know he was in a factory of some sort. So was that a part of why he could stay, or did you have anything in mind for that?
I kind of thought about what males would be left after a draft, who would get out of the service. And you and I had spoke before the podcast, and you actually looked up some of the ways that people could get out of being drafted, or there were like some special reasons why men over the age of 18 wouldn't get drafted.
Yeah, so a lot of what I found for it is that at 18, you're basically automatically. And so they would, in draft classes, basically, they would put you in a little pool and assign that pool a number, and then they would pick it from like a bigger pool of those, and then that's who was able to go up and who was drafted, essentially. And then there was things like being disabled, physically disabled, if you're in education, if you worked in an important war industry. And then there was an interesting one where men who were the primary support for children that are not their own, and then conscientious objectors, of course, which most of those conscientious objectors were, a lot of it was religious based. The Quakers made up 70% of those who were conscientious.
Can you imagine walking into a recruitment office and you say, it's against my religious holdings, and you get out of being deployed into D-Day and World War II? That is... Whew.
There's a lot of famous people who came up with some sort of excuse to be able to get out of it. If I remember correctly, Elvis Presley was deployed at one point, but I think even he, don't quote me on this, but I think he didn't have to fight just because of who he was. They brought him back, essentially.
Really?
I think
I
so.
did not know this story. That's crazy.
I wish I had some more research on that because...
Well, I'll let you look that up. And while you do, we had mentioned names in the previous recap episode. You may not know, but all of the names of the main characters are for famous people who were born in the year 1944. George comes from George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars. Was born in 1944. Michael, Beth's younger brother, is Michael Douglas, famous actor. And Elizabeth comes from one of my personal favorite psychologists in the field, Elizabeth Loftus, who does a lot of work on memory and jury testimony and the fallibility of like how influenced our memories can be.
Okay, so looking up, just kidding. He was not born in the 40s. Well, he was born in 35, but he would have not been old enough at this time to be able to serve. But later on,
Yeah, was it a different war?
I know he went to Germany, but he was discharged after being promoted to sergeant.
Elvis Presley walks in, swinging hips, gets promoted to sergeant. Hey, on and talking about that war there.
And it even says on March 2nd, with Priscilla in attendance, who I'm assuming was a lady of his, Presley waved goodbye to the fans and media of Germany and flew home. So, I mean, he was...
Well, Priscilla
even
was
if
his
he was
daughter,
over there... Oh, sorry, just kidding. His daughter. But even then, he was probably never in a place that would have gotten him hurt. He literally waved goodbye to fans. I mean, they didn't want him over there.
I'm just imagining dirty, gritty, tired, scared American troops in the dugout canals waiting for tank warfare. And Elvis Presley comes walking down the line. Hey, old man. Hey, old man. Just shooting fingers at everybody. He's like, we're going to win the war. It's close now, man. I can feel it. Well, let's go. Let's go.
Using that as an example, I know I've heard many stories about people who got out of it by doing similar things or making up excuses or injuring themselves.
So I honestly did not have a background reason for how Beth's dad got to stay. I just knew that some men would still be around, and he happened to be one of them. So I guess in hindsight, we could say he had an illness, or maybe he had a very important job. Like maybe he was the lead of the factory
of
there
that
in
factory
town,
that was producing something. Yeah. Women in the workplace, that a lot of that stemmed from World War II. Like they took over. There's a reason for Rosie the Riveter and all these amazing things that came from it. Like you said, I'm assuming some portions of factories, you had to stay and do that job if it was important.
Admittedly, that line about all the guys standing outside the factory talking about like, oh, what I would do if I had a gun, I'd go over there and defeat Russia myself. I should have included that a lot of women would be there in the conversation too, because they're the ones in the factories.
I love the fact that you made Elizabeth's mom so strong-headed and even-keeled, and you even describe her as, oh, she looks nice enough that either A, she went to a PTA meeting, or we're being bombed, and she's just well put together.
Yeah. Elizabeth, the world is ending.
I just thought it was such a cool character trait to add to this, that Elizabeth calmed down a little bit and was like, okay, my mom's got this. Even though she did end up going and unfortunately passing away through a car accident, she had that faith in her mom just from her mom's own confidence.
Well, it's kind of hard because we, right now, at Alternate Endings, we try to keep our stories between 5,000 and 7,000 words.
Yeah.
So usually around 30 to 40 minutes. And if you think about a TV show or a movie or books, it takes a long time to really sink your teeth into character development and to see personal growth and change. So sometimes I try to incorporate that, but it's very limited because we've only got, a certain amount of page. So I don't know if you noticed, but in the beginning of the story, George is supposed to be pretty weak-willed, and Beth is the strong one.
And she's the one dragging him along.
And somewhere in the middle, their roles change. She gets quiet, reserved. She begins crying more.
As she's trying to go home, and that's when George comes over and says, no, hey, we got this.
Yeah, he steps up to the plate and says, here's the plan. You go home, I go home. We'll get out of here. And so they kind of switch roles just because tragedy and something as confusing as bomb-laden balloons coming out of the night sky and lighting your entire town on fire, it's going to bring certain things out of you that you may or may not expect.
Fight or flight to the extreme. You're going to find out what you're made of in that sense.
Can you imagine the houses and the streets that you've driven down 100 times and they get affected in that manner. I mean, we as Americans have the luxury that most wars have never come on our soil, but there are other countries where wars get fought in their neighborhoods all the time. And it pains me to imagine being in a place that's supposed to be home and it gets blown up and you just don't feel safe.
On top of that, it was calm and serene, and you think this is a beautiful balloon. To all of a sudden, when you're driving away, screaming your head off, you've got to watch out for debris and for potentially a bomb falling on you as well. Because it's not a traditional battle scene. I mean, there's not armed forces down there trying to do anything. It's literally just based off of the weather on where a bomb is going to drop and how much weight the balloon still has attached to it. And is it going to drop it now or is it going to drop it later? There's so many different factors that go into it.
Makes me think of just the step in the evolution of war. Back in the 1700s, American Revolution, there were agreed upon areas where people would meet. They would literally stand single rank and file. They would load their muskets and they'd take turns firing. Can you imagine standing out there?
They would drum themselves up there. And then you go to a point where you can't even see your enemy.
Now we send machines over there driven by computers. People sitting in an air-conditioned office driving a drone to go over and kill people from thousands of miles away. Those two worlds coexist within just a few generations.
Yeah, and I think this is a perfect intermediate to that because it's exactly that. It's rudimentary, but at the same time, it's got the technology behind it that basically led us to where we are.
People say bayonets and knives is a very personal way to hurt someone. A gun is less personal. Mm-hmm. Imagine fitting out a weapon and letting the wind take it to some strange place and to possibly harm people that you will never personally meet and you'll never know, and you may never even find out if they died or not.
Yeah, exactly. You don't even know if it hit.
I think I forgot to mention earlier. So the military kept everything a secret, even from American citizens, until that one incident where the mom and her 5 children died. When that happened, the American military made a U-turn and started informing everybody who had been affected. Here's what it was. These came from Japan. We know it, but please do not tell anybody.
I was going to say, how far after was this? Was this
Let's see.
Still before the atomic bombs, or was this afterwards and then they just basically, oh, shoot, we forgot to tell people what these are. We should tell them.
So I got this information from atomicheritage.org, and this deadly incident killing 6 people happened on May 5th, 1945.
Okay, so beforehand.
It was 6 months after the first balloon launched, and it was 2 months after they stopped launching the balloons. So this balloon had actually sat there for probably weeks.
Yeah.
Nobody had touched it. And this kid comes up and kicks it and pays for it with his life.
And that's crazy to me that it happened before Hiroshima, yes. And that they still were saying, hey, keep this a secret, keep it quiet. And it never got out. That wasn't the end. That wasn't the point where everyone found out. That was still, it kept it a secret at that point.
Speaking of keeping it secret, when do you think was the last time we found one of these balloons intact?
96, 97.
Up in British Columbia, parts of Canada, the last time we found a fully intact balloon was in October of 2014.
2014.
And it is now full, intact, on display in a museum called the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada.
That is ridiculous that it lasted that long and wasn't torn to shreds by anything. I mean, it's like 60 plus years. That's 70 years of weather, wear and tear, trees, whatever it is that it landed in.
It's a well-made material.
Yeah.
It weathered every winter, every summer for 70 years.
And on top of that, never exploded. Do you know how they found it?
I don't. No, it was in the forest, somewhere rural. But they end the Radiolab episode with cautioning people, if you live in the Pacific Northwest especially, if you come upon this giant chandelier bomb-looking thing attached to a balloon...
Don't kick it.
Don't kick it. That who knows? We may still find another one out there.
And I could see it. I'm assuming that's included in the 300 that made it, and they just added another tally.
Right.
That's scary to think that maybe still somewhere out there. You never know. I mean, we're right in the Rockies. As far as we know, we could go out, and if one made it all the way to Detroit, they had to pass the Rockies at some point.
Oh, yeah.
We could easily go in there and find one.
It was fun to have a real thing, reimagine it occurring differently, dramatize it. But I really wanted people in the middle of the story to feel helpless and as if you were in a maze with no way out. I mean, if you saw slowly drifting balloons and you knew at the bottom of all of them was an explosive package, and you knew that they're just a slave to the direction of the wind, I wouldn't even know what to do. I would just kind of like play dodgeball with these bombs coming from the sky. Because essentially, if you saw it heading for you and you were out in a field, you could run fast enough to always avoid the next explosion. But
when there's 30 around you, you never know. I mean, that's essentially what happened to Elizabeth's mom. She was too worried about the bombs to notice what actually ended up being her downfall.
No pun intended.
No pun intended.
Rip Beth's mom.
Bless your soul, you strong-hearted woman.
Do you have anything for our listeners? Any last takeaways? Anything you didn't get to mention about the story?
War is not something that is ever going to be pretty by any means. It is not designed to be that way, and I feel like this is a great way to kind of share that. It's randomized. While there's obviously some sort of purpose to it, you really never know what's truly going to happen. And I think to place it in a time that is accurate and to set the way you set it so perfectly with the lingo and the phrasing, and is kind of full immersive, that you're in this serene, you think 1940s, it's that period beforehand the war, and maybe after, it's a period of
big band swing.
Yeah, exactly. And so for it to be interrupted by this bombing, I think that it shows how war really is, that it's directed at people. There's a target. Japan wants to kill Americans. Americans want to kill Germans. But you don't know any of these people. For these big balloons to come and affect this portion that, in all actuality, didn't affect the United States at all at the time. But they didn't know that, and they just figured it would have that. So
I don't know if it was World War II, but there's a fascinating series of tales of when humanity creeps in to soldiers' lives in war. I think it was the end of World War II. They were pushing against the Germans. They just couldn't make it. And there's some fascinating photos out on the internet where they would agree to take a lunch break. All the soldiers would come out of the trenches, and they'd even play soccer together. They shared liquor. They shared meals. They broke bread together. They shared cigarettes.
I think it may have been on Christmas, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
I think I know what you're talking about.
And then they quit, and they went back, and they resumed trying to kill each other.
Yeah.
Can you even imagine the compartmentalization that has to happen for you to do that? So, ladies and gentlemen, listeners of alternate endings out there, we just grazed the top of a very deep glacier for this story. It is fascinating. Please, please, please go out and check out Fugo on Radiolab, and check out this book by Ross Cohen, Fugo, The Curious History of Japan's Balloon Bomb Attack on America. And I don't know that I ever mentioned it, but the name of the Operation Fugo means balloon bomb in Japanese.
And I promise that if Fugo, I will go and read it as well.
Okay.
And with that, death comes for us all.
Thank you all for listening. Next episode, we return with a brand new audiobook story. Talk to you soon. Assuming the world is still standing by then.
We would like to thank Kevin MacLeod for his music found on Incompetech.com.